All right. Good morning, everyone. The Committee on Science and Technology will come to order. Pursuant to notice, the committee meets to consider the following measures. H.R. 364 to provide for the establishment of the Advanced Research Projects Agency, Energy. H.R. 1467, the 10,000 Trained by 2010 Act. H.R. 1716, the Green Energy Education Act of 2007. And H.R. 632, the H-Prize Act of 2007. Before we get started, though, with this markup, we have one quick piece of committee business to attend to. The distinguished member of California, Mr. Calvert, recently took a leave of absence from the committee to serve on appropriations. This left the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee without a ranking member. Last week, Mr. Hall announced that Representative Feeney would take over as ranking member of the subcommittee. And I now ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Science and Technology ratify the selection of Mr. Feeney as ranking member of the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee. Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, do you have to be present to be get that post? Or?
Yeah. Well, I'm considering that no objection, and or may I say I consider that a slight objection, and it's so ordered. I want to congratulate Mr. Feeney. Let me also say that Ken Calvert, I was been a ranking member of this committee, and Ken did much more than I did. He made an effort to go to every facility all across the country, and became very knowledgeable. And we want to, hope that he'll be a continuing asset. And I'm sure that Mr. Feeney will also do a good job. But Ken did a particularly good job, and hopefully he'll be there on appropriations to understand these issues. We now begin with the markup, and I will begin with a brief statement. Today the committee is marking up 4 bills. The first bill we will consider is a bill that I introduced, H.R. 364, which establishes the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy. In the subcommittee hearing and in the markup, we had a very healthy discussion that I believe pointed to the critical need for such an entity. We've worked hard with our friends from across the aisle, and while there are still a few differences, it has resulted in a better bill. It's my understanding that this discussion will continue today with a number of amendments, and I look forward to addressing those concerns. The next bill we will take up is H.R. 1467, the 10,000 Trained by 2010 Act, introduced by Chairman Wu. This is a good bill, which I support. There has been a lot of talk in Washington about the need to push healthcare IT forward. Our medical system is far behind other sectors in the use of information technology. However, it is common knowledge that information technology could significantly improve patient care and reduce healthcare costs. And let me just collaterally say that I have just introduced H.R. 2406. It's a healthcare IT bill that will be in the jurisdiction of this committee. It is wildly, and as I think Mr. Ginger can tell you, it's going to be wildly popular within the healthcare area. The doctors, physicians, everyone. Healthcare IT, or IT, it's in the healthcare area is one of the few areas that hasn't really matured. It's so popular that Newt Gingrich and Hillary Clinton are supporting this concept. And so I would suggest to all of you to take a look at it. Don't get involved if you don't want to, but I think you'll find that it will be something that's going to be a good bill and will be popular for you. And we also have H.R. 1716, the Green Energy Education Act of 2007, was introduced by Mr. McCall. And H.R. 1716 raises the profile of a very important issue, university research and education on clean energy, including energy efficiency and green building design and technologies. It would bring together the Department of Energy, a mission agency, and the National Science Foundation, which has a long history with science and technological education and a common goal to help educate the next generation of energy technology experts and green building professionals. This bill helps meet a very important need, and I thank Mr. McCall for bringing it to the committee. And who would have known he would have been such a greenie? But we thank you. This is a very this is a good bill. We also will consider Mr. Lipinski and Mr. Inglis, H.R. 362, the H-Prize Act of 2007. Hydrogen technology represents just the type of transformational possibilities that we are hoping to achieve with ARPA-E, and may someday make an important piece of our energy puzzle. And I commend our colleagues, Mr. Inglis and Mr. Lipinski, for working together to make this a good bipartisan bill, and I look forward to moving it through the committee today. So these are the 4 good bills that we have before us, and now I'd like to recognize Mr. Hall to present his opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, you and I have been working together now for over 22 years, and on the same side of the aisle for most of that time. And if it weren't for me switching parties, you might not even be chairman right now. And I've been talked to by 4/5 of you bunch asking me to switch back. Good group on both sides. I appreciate everybody on both sides of the speaker here. But, and you can thank me later if you'd like. But when you work with someone as long as we have, not only on this committee, but also on the Commerce Committee, we're on that committee together, there's bound to be some times when we're going to disagree. And as much as I dislike going against my friend from Tennessee, sometimes it just happens. As it turns out, today is one of those days. While I commend you, Bart, for your efforts on behalf of boosting energy R&D, I disagree with the way H.R. 364 does it. I have to say that I have a problem with the idea of creating a new bureaucracy within the Department of Energy that will, regardless of intention, fight for money with existing and future programs at DOE. With the tight budget parameters we're working with, I'm not comfortable authorizing the creation of ARPA-E based on a vague recommendation that was in the Gathering Storm report. The facts are that DOE currently has the authority to do ARPA-type projects, but DOE is woefully underfunded. I'm concerned that we could be faced with the problem of having both the Office of Science and ARPA-E underfunded so that neither of them is operating at full potential if we go forward with the creation of this new agency. And before we go forward with any ARPA-type projects, I'd like the Section 1821 study in EPAC to be completed that looks at the applicability of the DARPA management practices and the advisability of creating a DARPA-type agency within DOE before we move toward this legislation. And to that end, I'll be introducing an amendment that, without creating a new bureaucracy, would require the Secretary of Energy to identify and accelerate advanced research projects at the DOE that will address our energy needs. I, along with several of my colleagues, have sent a letter to the Secretary urging him to complete the study as mandated by law so that we all might benefit from its recommendations. In addition, the letter, we also ask the Secretary to appoint Technology Transfer Coordinator and establish the Technology Transfer Working Group. As several of our witnesses testified to in our committee hearing, technology transfer plays a very integral part in the process from basic research to widespread commercialization. I don't think anyone would dispute that our country needs clean, affordable, reliable energy that's generated through research and development. This committee should continue to advance legislation that addresses our most critical energy needs in a fiscally responsible manner. To that end, I'll be introducing legislation by the end of the week that'll help accomplish these goals. In addition to the ARPA-E legislation, we'll also be marking up H.R. 1467, H.R. 1716, and H.R. 632. I'm an original co-sponsor of H.R. 1467, the 10,000 Trained by 2010 Act, and I'm supportive of the primary goal it seeks to achieve. If implemented correctly and efficiently, health information technology can revolutionize our health care system, but we have to have an educated workforce properly trained in health IT in order for it to be successful. And this is what H.R. 1467 is about. NSF is already doing yeoman's work in the IT arena, but this measure will increase the focus on health IT. I encourage my colleagues to support it. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1716, the Green Energy Education Act of 2007, introduced by my fellow Texan, Mr. McCall. This is a good piece of legislation that was voted out of this committee in the last Congress. The fact that it's also being included in larger packages on both sides of the aisle in this Congress indicates its overwhelming support. Simply put, this measure encourages the Department of Energy to work with the National Science Foundation to help develop the next generation of engineers and architects to work effectively together to produce buildings that will incorporate the latest in energy-efficient technologies. I commend Mr. McCall for his fine work on this bill. Finally, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 62, the H-Prize Act sponsored by English and Lipinski. This legislation was introduced in the last Congress and passed overwhelmingly by the House of Representatives. This bill directs the Secretary of Energy to award competitive cash prizes biennially to advance the research, development, demonstration, and commercial application of hydrogen energy technologies. Categories eligible for prizes include advancements in certain hydrogen components or systems, prototypes of hydrogen-powered vehicles, and transformational changes in the technologies for hydrogen distribution or production. I commend Mr. English and Mr. Lipinski for introducing this legislation. I encourage my colleagues to support it. Once again, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to be supportive of these three bipartisan pieces of legislation. I look forward to working with you to advance these bills. I yield back my time, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. As you have pointed out, we've had a good working relationship, and I'll point out that every bill that's come out of this committee has been unanimous, and the only one bill received 21 negative votes on the floor. That's the worst we've done on the floor. We're going to have, I hope, 3 unanimous bills today, and I think the reason that we've been able to do this is we've started with good bills. We've had extensive consultation, and by making better bills. At the end of the day, we are going to have our first disagreement, but I think 2 things will happen. We're going to have amendments today that will make the bill even better, and I think at the end of the day that it will be a bipartisan bill, but it won't be a unanimous bill, and we'll try to proceed without kicking or scratching, and we'll get this done. So without objection, members may place statements in the record at this point. We will now consider H.R. 364 to provide for the establishment of advanced research projects, agency energy. I yield myself 5 minutes to describe the bill. H.R. 364 addresses the National Academies of Science Rising Above the Gathering Storm, which recommended establishing an ARPA-E to shorten the time period for transforming research into technologies that will make us more energy efficient, sustain our economy, achieve energy security, and improve our environment. Energy powers our economy and supports the quality of life we enjoy in this country. We owe it to our children and grandchildren to tackle our energy supply problems now before we reach a crisis. By investing in research, development, and deployment of new technologies, we can deliver to them an energy-secure future. If you're satisfied with the status quo, and you believe that the current pace of technology transfer will get us to the energy future we need, then you would conclude we do not need an ARPA-E. However, if you're not satisfied with our current progress, if you believe we need a new model of technology transfer that moves creative basic science from the laboratory bench to the marketplace, you should support H.R. 364. We must engage the private sector, the national labs, and the universities in a manner not done today, and we need a strong, cohesive community of researchers, technology developers, intent on transforming our energy economy as we know it. I want to thank my colleagues on the committee for working with me on this bill. Over the past 2 weeks, we've had very productive discussions that are embodied in several of the amendments we will consider this morning. Mr. English and Mr. Bartlett have been especially helpful in the effort to craft this legislation, and the bill will be improved this morning as a result of their efforts. Our constituents get the best outcome when we work together to achieve our common goals. So I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 364 and vote for a brighter, more secure energy future. And let me read to the committee just a few of the endorsements. We really haven't sought endorsements, but to give you an idea of the wide breadth of this, the American Public Power Association, the American Iron and Steel Institute, the American Petroleum Institute, the American Society for Mechanical Engineers, the American Federation of Scientists, the Edison Electric Institute, the Gas Technology Institute, the Independent Petroleum Association of America, the MIT, the National Association of Manufacturers, the National Hydrogen Association, the National Association of Rural Electric Cooperatives, Texas A&M, University of Michigan, the Climate Policy Center, the National Commission on Energy Policy, and they continue to come in every day. So this is widely supported. So now I recognize Mr. Hall to present any remarks on the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I think I pretty well expressed myself in the opening statement in that it creates another agency within DOE and it's way too expensive. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Yes, sir, Mr. Robacher.
I'm sorry, I haven't really studied the bill. I'll have to admit that, and I will have to note that I disagree with my ranking member respectfully that the idea of just creating a new bureaucracy. I mean, I think that this is just the opposite of that. I think it is actually a way to get around bureaucracy and try to get some resources directly to some creative thinking people who. And so I would be inclined to support your concept. I'm interested in how we're going to pay for it and how much we're talking about here, and maybe you could enlighten us to where we're going to get the money and how much is going to be spent.
Mr. Robacher, I think that's a very fair question. First of all, you're correct. The idea is to get around the bureaucracy. This is a DARPA-type program. This is going to be a very thin program. I hope there's less than 100 people. They're going to subcontract this out to the private sector, the public sector, to national labs. You're going to have a program manager that's going to try to, corral all this. And the reason you want to get it out of the bureaucracy is, and Mr. Ehlers he spoke to it eloquently the other day when he said, a part of science research is failing. This is high risk, high reward. Some of these are going to fail. We expect them to fail. If you're in the Department of Energy and you fail, then you're in trouble. Here, we want to take those risks, just like the Internet. Developing the Internet was a risk. Developing stealth technology.
Well, that I agree with you. What about the money?
What about the money? Okay, the money. At the start of this session, I think it was maybe the fifth bill. I'm not sure. There was a bill in Congress that is also, I think, passed the Senate that needs to be a compromise or needs to be conferenced that will do away with the tax breaks that were given to so-called big oil for additional drilling in the last Congress. The feeling was that with the price of oil at the high as it is, they don't need additional incentives to go drilling. And I think that's several $billion. I'll ask the council. Do you know how many billions of dollars that is?
I believe it's scored at $14 billion, roughly.
That's $14 billion.
Well, Mr. Chairman, that's the right
right
answer because I happen to be one of the few Republicans who voted against those tax incentives that I didn't feel were necessary at a time of high profit as well. So that is the right answer.
So we have spoken directly with the Speaker about this. This is a high priority for her. Again, in the whole, so many of the private sector. So we will be going into that trust fund for those, that money. Now, again, in all honesty, when you get into bookkeeping, I guess it's one part of the other part, but I mean, that's where we intend to go for new money.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would feel more comfortable with this if it indeed was being taken out of the current bureaucracy and being fenced off. And I know a lot of people would have just the opposite reaction. To me, it makes more sense. But by and large, the idea about having a DARPA-like agency or a DARPA-like effort in the Department of Energy is a sound idea. We have national security today depends on energy self-sufficiency and efficiency, and I'm going to be supportive of this concept and your legislation.
Mr. Chairman. Over here.
Okay, let me just see if anybody from this side of the aisle want to comment. Ms. Gifford, then we'll rotate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to speak briefly and congratulate you and thank you for bringing this bill forward. As we head into the Memorial Day weekend, we see record high prices for gasoline. And what this piece of legislation does effectively is deal with three major issues that we face every day in southern Arizona, we face across our country. Energy independence, making sure that we start investing in energy sources that are completely independent of foreign countries and that so that we can be self-sustaining. The second area is global warming. And we're testimony time and time again about how our planet is getting hotter, how we need to start investing in new types of technology, new energy systems that are going to be clean and that are not going to be releasing greenhouse gases. The third area is U.S. competitiveness. We need, as the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report talks about, we need to make sure that we are producing scientists and engineers and mathematicians so that we can compete in this global new economy, where we are graduating 60,000 engineers, China graduates 600,000 engineers. So this piece of legislation, Mr. Chairman, pulls together some of the most pressing issues of our day and offers a solution that, and like you said, Mr. Chairman, some people will fail, but here we have a DARPA-like agency where engineers and scientists can be free to think totally outside the box and have that breakthrough eureka moment that is so important if we need to change the way that we live on this planet. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking forward to voting for this bill. I want to thank you again for bringing it forward.
Ms. Biggert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question. You talked about the fund of $14 million, I believe. Is there a provision in this bill which will allow access to that fund?
I don't know that.
Did you say billion or million?
Billion.
Billion.
I think I said million, but I meant billion.
Sure. I don't know how you would have in an authorization any kind of language that would tap into an appropriation. We would like to do it. I wish we could, but I don't think that would be possible.
Well, we seem to be doing this in the housing, where we have an affordable housing fund established. Couldn't we have a bill that would, if money is authorizing you take that money if it's appropriated by the appropriators?
No, I don't think there's any way you can do that. I mean, if you potentially, if this was Ways and Means and going through Ways and Means, they might be able to go back to that tax provision. But I don't think it's possible to do it with this type of authorization.
What about the Highway Trust Fund?
Well, we don't have authority over the Highway Trust Fund.
No, I know, but this is similar. We actually authorized the money for the highway.
The Transportation Committee does.
Yes.
But this is not.
But isn't there a way to establish that this provision would be in this bill? Otherwise, there's $14 billion there, and then we're going to go for $6 billion someplace else.
Yeah. The simple fact is the fund isn't jurisdictional to us. What I would like to do is, we have a period of time between this bill now going to the floor where we can have a manager's amendment, coming back in conference. And let me point out to you, a similar bill had 67 co-sponsors in the Senate, including McConnell and Reed, and passed there with less than 10 opposition votes. But I would love to be able to find a way to guarantee these funds, and we will be happy to work with you between now and the final day to do that. And it would be, as Ms. Guilford said, a eureka moment if we can accomplish that. So we'll work together and try to do so, but I don't see it how that can happen, and I certainly don't have language for it today.
There is a fund that we have presently that the appropriators have tried to do away with, and we've always made it how important it is, and that's a fund for scientists when they're working on a project and discover that in the Office of Science, and then discover that what they were working on fails, but they've found something else, and they can switch to that based on the funds that are available through that. It seems like there's some way that we could get this into the bill.
Yeah, I would suggest that we work on that together, and we'll have a manager's amendment to accomplish that, and we'll have a duet eureka if we can get that accomplished.
Thank you. Yield.
The gentleladies yield.
Yes, I yield to the ranking member.
Approach this in the, by the way, doesn't the Senate bill, it doesn't set up a new agency. That's half of my objection. That they've cured for us. And it still costs more, and we're trying to follow the Gathering Storm recommendations. It still costs more than the Gathering Storm reported by $1.6 billion additional. And I'd ask the gentlelady if she understands that this, and Professor Ayers would understand that this practically and potentially takes away from basic research at the Office of Science, which was also a priority of the Gathering Storm report. It's too much and creates a new agency. That's my basic objections to it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If the gentlelady would yield just to respond to Mr. Hall. In response to his suggestion, we will have a manager's amendment that will reduce the authorizing level by $1.4 billion, again, trying to, in an effort to be responsive. And we will also, I think there's going to be an amendment by Mr. Inglis that will provide protection for the Office of Science. Again, trying to make a good bill better.
Reclaiming my time, I think that we'll be speaking to that amendment, but I also have one that will increase the funding, or make sure that the Office of Science is full funding for the priority. I think that Mr. Inglis's amendment really sets a floor, which is appropriators will look at and say that that's all that they have to fund the Office of Science if his amendment is passed. But we'll address that later. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Bilbrey.
It's obvious that my dear colleague from California hadn't read the bill, because I think he had seen red lights that we recognized when we made the mistake, or some people around here made the mistake of creating what they thought would be the super agency for Homeland Security, and that creating a new structure and with a new name was somehow going to break through and create new answers, when in fact it created new problems. And so I just ask my colleagues to look seriously at the issue that so often we're so quick as elected officials to want to put our name onto a new agency so we can say we created that agency. And I don't need to go down the list of how many agencies that we created supposedly going to educate our children in poverty as we know it, secure our neighborhoods. And when in reality, we spend a lot of money on a structure and not on answers. And I just think that too often that a comparison with DARPA is not appropriate at this level. DARPA has a guaranteed market, the United States government, when it produces a product. And what you're proposing today is the United States government's going to be buying this energy or whatever product comes out of this agency. It's a whole different approach to this. And I just ask that we at least have some peer review by the scientists about what does work or doesn't work. I mean, the American of Chemical Societies sat there and said that they saw the Office of Science that would be the vehicle that is underfunded right now by $500 million in unmet opportunities. Creating a new agency doesn't fulfill the scientific demand out there or the unmet opportunities just by hiring people to supervise another side of this issue. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman, but I just want to raise my concerns on this. Yes, I would, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. You raise a lot of issues there. Let me try to address some of them. On the one hand, you say, just giving more money doesn't solve problems. Well, so if you think that the Department of Energy, with doing the status quo right now, is adequate, which is basically what you're arguing for, then everything's hunky-dory.
Reclaiming my time.
Sure.
I'm not saying that, Mr. Chairman. I'm saying that creating a new separate section while you have the Committee on Science, and then expect this new section to tool up, create its whole bureaucracy, create its internal protocols, and then be able to respond, is exactly the mistake we made with Homeland Security.
I was going to get to that. So again, first of all, I think there's an argument for status quo. The second thing is, you're absolutely correct about the HS ARPA, the Homeland Security ARPA. It was a mess. And we learned from that. And the reason it was a mess is it was a part of the bureaucracy. ARPA-E is not going to be a part of the bureaucracy. It's going to report directly to the Secretary of Energy. It is going to be a DARPA model. It is going to be a very thin little line. And so the work is going to be done outside of Washington, outside the Department of Energy. You're going to have a program director that, to a great extent, is going to be the maestro that's going to work with private sector, universities, the labs, to bring all this together. The whole idea is to take it out of the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is not performing properly. Status quo is not getting the job done. This is going to be different than what they did in Homeland Security.
Reclaiming my time,
Certainly.
Mr. Chairman. Look, the direction comes from up above. And the fact is that the priorities have been set by the administration, both the past administration, which did everything to decommission zero generation, shut down hydroelectric, shut down, basically defund the ITER technology, which is exactly the kind of definition we're talking about, that developing fusion. The previous administration abandoned it. The present one didn't. You're not going to change that by creating a new structure with a new set of bureaucrats that are going to still be bureaucrats once you've created them. And that to think that extra layer is somehow going to get out from the administrative oversight, that's the challenge that we have to do to get both administrations, Democrats and Republicans, to focus on this. But it's so easy to talk about process, that by creating a new agency, we'll create a secret process or a new process that will change the outcome. It's the substance that leads to the outcome that matters. And process be damned, I agree with you that the outcome has not been successful. I just don't think this vehicle will be the vehicle to get to the outcome that you're aiming for. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Your argument is an argument for let's continue to do what we're doing, and that is a fair argument. And if you want to support status quo and you think that's getting the job done, you should oppose this bill. If you're not satisfied with status quo and you want a new approach, then we're going to try to make that available. So if it's all right with everyone, Mr. Ellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief word on this latest argument. I wouldn't hold up Homeland Security Department as a good example for anything, and that's what my colleague is doing. He's holding it up as a bad example, and it's simply because we took a collection of a large number of different departments, all filled with bureaucrats, and threw them all in one pot and says, "Okay, do your work." It just hasn't worked well. The difference here is we're not talking about hiring more bureaucrats. We're hiring scientists and turning them loose. And I've always said the most effective way to get good results is hire the best scientists, give them enough money to work with, close the door and walk away and let them do their work. Because you get the most productivity, the brightest ideas at that point. So I don't think that the analogy with Homeland Security is valid at all. This will be a separate agency. It can be destroyed by over-administration. I think to a certain extent that has happened to the Department of Energy over the years. It's been a stellar agency, but it's been mismanaged during the past, during the decade of the 90s, let's say. But this gives us an opportunity to try a different approach with a separate but integrated agency. And I think it's certainly worth an experiment worth doing. We will know in a decade whether or not the experiment is working, and at that time, our successors can make a judgment as to whether or not it should continue. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ellers, Dr. Ellers. I know, to be courteous to members, there are several markups going on, and folks have other things to do today, so I'm going to ask unanimous consent that this bill is considered as read and open to amendments at any point, and that members proceed with amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment to bill. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. So ordered. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. This amendment makes a series of perfecting changes in our efforts to move the best bill possible out of the committee. These changes are based upon discussion during the subcommittee markup and discussion that we've had over the past 2 weeks. First, there are several changes to address the issues related to hiring authority of the director and the selection of the talented individuals to serve as program managers and staff. Having the right staff is critical to the success of ARPA-E. This is intended to be a lean operation. Nothing in the amendment alters that goal. The amendment gives the director discretion to hire technical, financial, and managerial staff in addition to the program managers. The amendment also specifies that the director should look toward academia, in addition to private industry and former DARPA staff, in making selections for the initial staff of ARPA-E. Furthermore, the amendment recognizes that the director is not expected to know the universe of the talented individuals capable of functioning as technical staff of ARPA-E, and therefore may contract with outside firms specializing in recruiting such talent. The amendment also provides some technical corrections and programs and clarifications related to the authority of the program managers. As I've stated before, ARPA-E is to be a lean, responsive organization with the freedom to pursue high-risk, high-payoff research. The amendment clarifies the program manager's roles in this process. The amendment also clarifies the program manager's authority and responsibility to recommend the termination of any project that does not show promise. However, only the person authorized to enter into contracts has the legal authority to terminate that contract. The amendment also changes the name of the fund set up in this bill to reflect the evolution of thought since the bill was first written in 2005. We are now focused on transforming the energy sector for reasons beyond just energy independence. The amendment drops the final year of the authorization to change the bill from a 6-year to a 5-year authorization. The bill reduces the overall cost of H.R. 364 by $1.4 billion. Finally, in response to concerns expressed by a number of committee members, the advice of outside parties, and witnesses' testimony at the subcommittee hearing, this amendment drops the recoupment section of the bill. I think this is a non-controversial amendment which further perfects the bill, and I urge my colleagues to support its adoption.
Mr. Chairman, I see the manager's amendment strives to make some improvements to the bill. Still not comfortable with the structure of the underlying bill. I still agree with the Senate that does not set up a new agency, as you do. And the amendments, money-wise, I think you would wind up with $4.9 billion, and the amendment I'll send up is $750 million. There's quite a difference there, and I think we both are trying to pattern as much as we can after the Gathering Storm reports that Norm Augustine wrote, and I believe that yours is $1.6 billion more than that Gathering Storm report requested, substantially more. And for that reason, I object to it.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I think we take care of your number figure in this manager amendment. We reduced the authorization by $1.4 billion, and we thank the many members on both sides of the aisle that made recommendations that have been incorporated into this manager amendment.
I'll wait right here and watch.
Okay. If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the vote is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The second amendment on the roster is an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Hall, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
An amendment to desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 364, offered by Mr. Hall of Texas, Mr. Gingrey of Georgia, and Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, there seems to be a consensus that the types of projects ARPA-E would engage in would be beneficial to addressing our country's ongoing energy supply needs, but I think we tend to diverge when we look to find out how to implement these projects. Chairman Gordon's bill would create a new bureaucracy within the Department of Energy that would oversee ARPA-E. I don't feel that this is the best way to do this. Rather than jumping right into the idea that it has a one-in-one record, in the first place, DARPA at DOD was considered a success, and the other one is ARPA at Homeland Security, as suggested by a gentleman from California, was considered a failure. So rather than jumping right into an idea that has a one-in-one or an even record, I feel we really need to approach this with a little more caution and skepticism before throwing $4.9 billion into an unknown. Now, some are going to argue that we don't have time to wait and study the idea, but I disagree with that. The DOE is a $23 billion agency that's currently conducting research in all areas that H.R. 364 directs ARPA-E to address. So to take a step back and say, let's make sure that this is the right thing to do before committing billions of taxpayer dollars, I think makes some sense. The Hall-Gingrey-Biggert substitute amendment recognizes that while the Department of Energy has the authority to promote technology transfer of basic and applied research, there's a need to more quickly identify, I think, opportunities to accelerate the commercial application of new energy technologies to meet our national energy needs. Also, a more fully integrated approach to advanced energy research is going to help bridge the gap between basic research and applied technology to overcome long-term and high-risk barriers to the development of advanced energy technologies. With an eye toward fiscal conservatism, my substitute is considered a condition on the Section 1821 study in EPAC. This was a study that requires DOE to look at, quote, best practices, unquote, management at the Department of Energy, including DARPA to DOE. And I've sent, by the way, the Secretary a letter to complete this study and requesting that. And I had 12 of my colleagues here join with us. Substitute amendment does not create a new agency, but requires the Secretary to use his existing authority coupled with the newly established DARPA hiring authority to undertake ARPA-type projects. It authorizes $750 million, not $4.9 billion over 5 years for the Secretary to carry out the projects, and requires the Secretary to report to Congress on their status. So it also allows the Secretary to coordinate with other agencies on advanced energy projects, directs the Secretary to coordinate with the appointed to be appointed technology transfer coordinator, and allows the Secretary to award prizes for achievement under an advanced energy research project and establishes cost sharing according to the Energy Policy Act of 2005. I think this substitute amendment is sensible. I think it's a responsible alternative to the underlying bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back, sir.
Mr. Gingrey is recognized. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I rise to support the Hall-Biggert-Gingrey amendment. I think the idea of ARPA-E certainly has merit, and I can understand how it came forward. You know, it's sort of interesting how we come up with acronyms, and the acronym DARPA sounds good, has a good ring to it. But if we followed that line, then this new agency would be called ERPA. So we decided to name it ARPA-E, which sounds a little bit better. The one in the Homeland Security Department, I guess we could call that HARPA. That doesn't have a real good ring to it, and it wasn't very successful. But I agree with the ranking member, Mr. Hall, in regard to creating yet another expensive agency within the Department of Energy. When, as he pointed out, we're talking about a $23 billion agency, which really right now I think is working. The Department of Energy, with its Secretary Sam Bodman, chemical engineer by training, someone that is running a good department in the Office of Science within the Department of Energy, I think is probably the place where this kind of activity should be under existing funding. And there's a recent letter, Mr. Chairman, you're familiar with it, from the American Chemical Society, of which I'm a member as a graduate of Georgia Tech with a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry. But I just believe that the ranking member hit the nail right on the head in regard to this. It sounds good, but it's growing the government. It's unnecessary. It's duplication. Instead of really being ARPA-E and sounded good, we ought to call it ERPA and reject it. So I yield back my time. Mr. Biggers recognized.
Thank you, move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know how hard you worked on this, and I think that we all agree that this project is very important. Research and development is very important, and I think really the only difference that we're really talking about is whether to have it within the Department of Energy or have it as a separate agency. And I think that over the years, and you've been on this committee, I've been on this committee, we've really worked to improve the Department of Energy. And there's I'd like to just read a couple words from a hearing that was held last year in March of 2006. Dr. Mowry, who was Dr. David Mowry, testified from the University of California at Berkeley and talking about proposals for expanded R&D in energy. In alternative energy, he said, we're very positive. He served on a National Academy of Science panel that assessed the value of DOE investments in alternative energy, energy conservation, and energy efficiency programs. And the consensus was that the returns of these investments were positive, and the committee felt that the Department of Energy had overall done an effective job of managing these. And I think that probably is true, but I think that they can do better, and we can do better. And I think to bring it back to the department, I think we worked on improving the Office of Science to be the research and development as the starting point there. And they've always worked with outside groups. And I think that to put it in there would be a benefit to have improvement. You know, I worked on GNAP and was very frustrated with the department when they wouldn't do a systems analysis to really get the nuclear program going. And we've argued about that. So I think there's a lot of room, but I hate to just hear everybody saying how bad the Department of Energy has done and the Office of Science, because I think if we look back, I remember going to Argonne with then Secretary of Energy, Spence Abraham, and looking at the fuel cell that was being developed for the hydrogen cars. And it was a big fuel cell, and he said, how fast can you reduce that so that we can put it into a car? And I have since then driven a hydrogen car. So I think all of the things that they're there, we just need to have the oversight and to have a program like this that they can use. You know, we changed the title from the Director of Office of Science to the Undersecretary, so that to give that top priority. And here I think we're not ignoring the problem. We're not for status quo. We really, it's imperative that all of us, with the global economy and the global competition, that we move with expeditious means. I think the only difference I see is that to take it out of the Department of Energy, where I think they've been moving and we've given them more direction, and we can proceed expeditiously that way. With that, I will yield back. I support the...
If the gentlelady would yield, just once again, you know, they're not good guys and bad guys here. They're just two different opinions. If you're for status quo, then you should support Mr. Hall's amendment. And if you're not, you should oppose it. And we are not taking it out of the Department of Energy. We're taking out of the Department of Energy's bureaucracy. It reports directly to the Secretary of Energy. So it's still within the Department of Energy. It just reports directly without having to go through the bureaucracy. And if I could make one final point, a part of the amendment best illustrates why we need to have a change. A part of this amendment suggests that the Department of Energy should have a study to determine whether or not this is a good idea. Well, on July of 2005, we passed legislation that required the department to have a study, return it within 18 months of whether this should be done. That study was due January 2007. We still don't have it. I mean, if that is the best argument for getting out of the Department of Energy, they can't even do the study. So again, you know, there's not good guys or bad guys. There's just two views, and I yield back.
It's time for a change worked for in a broader sense for you on the other side of the aisle last year, but I do think that we're not ignoring the problem. We're not for the status quo. We all want to work to ensure that the Department of Energy moves forward. And I think this debate, the Senate has said that it could be within the Department of Energy, and so maybe we'll come back to discuss this again. But I would yield to Mr. Bilbray.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
I think just to get us in the right, I think your time is, and I've been part of it, is more than expired. Let's recognize Mr. Bilbray can strike the last word, be on his own time there.
Strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just think, in all fairness, that the characterization that anyone who opposes this bill is for the status quo, I think is inappropriate and unfair. I think that we got to recognize that there are many different approaches to how we move forward with the energy independence issue, and that just because someone may not agree with the chair's bill here doesn't mean that they do not want to move forward and do not want to try new things. I just think it's quite unfair to say it's either a status quo, it's either the way it is now or my way. And my way is the only way to change things. And I think and I think even the chair will recognize that's a unfair characterization. I think that what we have is a proposal here to create a new vehicle, new structure, and think that it will get on operation and be more effective earlier than using the science committee. I mean, the science department over there, they're able to tool up and be able to move forward with their agenda. And if you think that you can create a new agency or new structure and be able to move forward before the existing structure can tool up and move forward with a new approach, that's the difference we have here. But I just think it's unfair to say that it's so cut and dry that there are those who want nothing done and those who are on my side. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hall's recognized.
Would the gentleman or the lady? Yeah. Mr. Chairman, it's not a status quo. We're directing the department to do type ARPA-E projects. I think we go really more out of the status quo than you do, in that we direct them to. I've read your instructions to them. I may be wrong, but I don't find in yours where you use the word shall. Maybe you do, but we clearly do. You can't say that we're only status quo when then initial projects were set out here said not later than 270 days after the date of enactment of this act, the Secretary shall designate up to 2 ARPA-E projects for funding. That's a direction to them. That's not status quo. The Senate, you may have some shalls. I just quickly looked over them, but your shalls aren't as strong as my shalls. Mine are in capital letters, and written ugly. But and one of the few things I agree with the Senate on is that we don't need a new agency within the Department of Energy. And go ask the Department of Energy what they think about having this within their department there to do battle with. I don't think you'll find anybody over there for it, but that doesn't make it good or bad. But those are facts. And money, we set up so much funds as needed to carry out the purpose. We didn't set up. The Senate has that. Well, I'm with the Senate now, and it's unusual for me to be for the Senate. But this is not status quo. It's just not as much money by a long shot that you're suggesting to put into the Department of Energy, and the Senate's going to knock off just quick as it gets over there.
Thank you, sir. I think it's probably time to move on. I will just point out, it may not have been a big hairy shall, but the Department of Energy was told that it shall contract to have a study on whether or not there should be something similar to ARPA-E that was supposed to have been presented in the shall sense to Congress in January of 2007. They've never even contracted it out. So, shalls, you got to do more than shall there.
Mr. Chairman?
That's the reason we sent the letter to him, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me again note that I think that your basic concept is correct, and that an ARPA-E concept is something that might be very beneficial as compared to the way the setup is now at the Department of Energy. You have made the argument that this is still part of the Department of Energy. Let me note, however, that your argument about the status quo not working and those hesitant about your idea favor the status quo. If your position is that the status quo is not working as it should be at the Department of Energy in terms of energy development, we should be taking the funds from that status quo that is not working and using that as the basis for a restructuring, rather than trying to just bring in other funds when your position is that the current funds being spent in the status quo are not working. So while I am supporting your concept, again, I am very concerned about the redirection of funds when you, by your very premise, are suggesting that the current funds are not being put to best use.
Would Chairman yield?
I certainly would.
And you're aware of the fact that under authorization in my amendment, in our amendment here, we authorized $750 million over 5 years for ARPA-E projects at DOE. There's $4.9 billion without saying exactly where it's going to come from, and the Senate, probably more sensible than either of us, has set up that they authorize so much funds as are needed to carry out the purposes, and at that time, as they're needed, they have to relegate or designate where those funds are coming from. That's what you're asking for, and that's what you're not getting.
Right, and again, the idea of having ARPA-E is certainly, I believe, the correct idea. But if we are going to restructure because the current system is not working, that's where we should be getting the funds from that system that is not working.
If there's no further, excuse me.
Could the gentleman yield just one additional thought, Mr. Rohrabacher?
I'm sorry. Who is? Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
It seems to me that if we've got an agency that's not doing what they ought to do, if we give them a whole lot more money, we're kind of rewarding them for doing what we don't want them to do. And I think what you're saying makes a certain amount of sense. Let's take the money out of the department and put it where it's going to do some good. If we've already told them they shall do a report, they haven't done it, then I say let's take their funding and put it into something that will do it. But let's not reward them by doubling their funding. Thank you.
If there's no further discussion on the amendment, then all in favor say aye. 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 Oh, excuse me, no. All in favor say aye. We'll do that again. We will start over, Mr. Hall, so there will be no confusion. All in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. No. The noes seem to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would request a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon. Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall votes no. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Mr. Lampson. Mr. Lampson votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Kanjorski. Ms. Hooley. Ms. Hooley votes no. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Mr. Malasa. Mr. Malasa votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Rohrbacher.
Reluctantly, no.
Mr. Rohrbacher votes no. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Ehlers.
Also reluctantly, no.
Mr. Ehlers votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Bonner. Mr. Bonner votes aye. Mr. Feeney. Mr. Feeney votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Bolart. Aye. Mr. Bolart votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye.
Is there anyone who did not have an opportunity to cast a vote? Mr. Inglis.
Mr. Inglis votes no.
Okay. You can report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 12 members vote aye and 24 members vote no.
The motion is not agreed to. The third amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Inglis. I think he just, oh, here he is, okay. Mr. Inglis, do you need to have yours moved further down? Okay. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364 offered by Mr. Inglis of South Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without further objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In between two markups, so hopefully this is going to work. This amendment is designed to do a couple of things to hope improve the bill. And we've had discussions with the chairman's staff about this. And I very much appreciate the chairman's openness to working to address some concerns we've had. The amendment addresses three major concerns. One is protecting the existing research in the Office of Science. Second is protecting ARPA-E from earmarks. And third is finding a way to clarify how ARPA-E will overcome the Valley of Death tech transfer issue. So that first item, the amendment provides at least 1 year of protection for existing funding levels for the Office of Science, basically providing that no funds can be initially given for ARPA-E unless authorized funds for the Office of Science are at FY07 appropriated levels plus the inflation rate. So the concept there is ARPA-E can be funded, but only after Office of Science is funded at least FY07 levels plus inflation. So the first year that ARPA-E would exist, the test is whether the Office of Science has been funded. If it has been funded at FY07 plus inflationary rate, then ARPA-E can receive funds. So that's the first goal, is to protect the existing existing research of the Office of Science. The second was to protect ARPA-E from earmarks, and there what we've done in this amendment is it directs the program managers of ARPA-E to select projects, quote, on the basis of merit, close quote, with advice from the advisory committee where appropriate. Legislative protecting against earmarks is difficult, but this merit review approach has succeeded in keeping the Advanced Technology Program, ATP, completely free from earmarks for the past 10 years. And so hopefully it'll work in the case of ARPA-E. The third goal we had here was finding a way to clarify how ARPA-E would overcome the Valley of Death issues. And so what we provide for here is a minimum of 2.5% allocation for tech transfer and outreach activities. And in addition, applicants applying for ARPA-E projects must consider future commercial applications of the project, including how commercial entities could be included to help increase market application of the technology. So those three changes are what's in the amendment, and I would urge my colleagues to accept the amendment as an improvement of ARPA-E.
The questions raised, or the gentleman raised these questions at the subcommittee markup. They were very constructive. We worked in a way to try to accomplish that. Again, you've made a good bill better, and I recommend passage of this amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentlelady is recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I thank the chairman. I'm sorry to say that I strongly oppose this amendment by my colleague. While it purports to protect the DOE Office of Science for at least 1 year, I think it does no such thing, and that's really why I take issue with this amendment. The amendment says we should fund ARPA-E before we fund the DOE Office of Science. That we should fund DOE before ARPA-E. I'll give my colleague that much. But where does it set the bar? It sets the bar at the level of the FY07 budget for DOE Office of Science plus inflation. And inflation is currently somewhere between 2 and 3%, I think. So this bar sets the bar so low that if you're not looking down, you'll trip over it. I think that as part of his American Competitive Initiative, the President has proposed to double the funding for DOE Office of Science over 10 years. In his FY07 budget request for the Office of Science, the President requested a 14% increase. Congress didn't give it to him, so we're already behind. He requested a 16% increase in FY08. Whether or not Congress will provide that increase remains to be seen, and I certainly hope we would, especially under the leadership of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that we would fund it as part of their innovation agenda. They have advocated doubling the budget for DOE Office of Science in half the time that the President has proposed. So in fiscal year 2007, if Congress provides the DOE Office of Science only an inflationary increase and then starts funneling money into the new ARPA-E bureaucracy, that's sure not likely to fund much research in year one. So I think that this Congress would have failed miserably. So we will have failed to live up to our commitment to fund the ACI. Our Democratic colleagues will have failed to live up to their innovation agenda, and we will be failing to adequately fund research in the physical sciences. I've been one of the strongest advocates for the DOE Office of Science since being elected to Congress in 1998. And why? Well, because when I arrived at Congress, I learned very quickly how much we had underfunded basic research in the physical sciences. Between 1994 and 2003, spending on research in the physical sciences shrank from 50% to less than 40% of the total federal R&D spending as Congress put more money into the life sciences. During roughly that same period, the DOE Office of Science, the nation's primary supporter of research in the physical sciences, funding over 40% of basic research in the physical sciences, more than any other federal agency, had received flat funding. But in constant dollars, its budget has been reduced by roughly 13%. Unfortunately, the research itself had been most significantly impacted since the cost to maintain existing facilities and their associated staff continued to rise with inflation. Only in recent years have we made some progress filling this hole, but we won't see a real progress until we provide the increases outlined in the President's ACI and the Democrats' innovation agenda. These are the increases that the Augustine Committee heartily endorsed and clearly said were a greater priority than ARPA-E. Increasing the Office of Science budget by the rate of inflation just won't cut it, and it shouldn't be where we set the bar for ARPA-E. I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Yield back the bench.
Young lady, yield before she yields
I
back.
will yield to the ranking member.
Is it your position that there's no adequate protection for the Office of Science and that they provide for only 1 year and the threshold for funding is not adequate?
Are you asking me or Mr. English?
Yes, is that your position?
That is my
I understand.
position.
And do you not have an amendment a little bit later that addresses this?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I don't think we ought to, I don't like the concept of tying the hands of the Director or the Secretary of Energy, and I object to the amendment. Ask the committee to vote no.
There's no further discussion. The vote will be on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The ayes have it. The fourth amendment on the roster, let's see, is from the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Biggert. I think you're going to, but are you skipping number 4 and going on to a later amendment, Ms. Biggert?
I'm skipping number 4 and going to number 5.
Okay. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364 offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Make sure I have the right one here. Okay, my amendment is very straightforward. It simply requires that Congress fully fund the Department of Energy's Office of Science before spending billions of dollars on a new, untested ARPA-E. I wish I could say that I came up with this idea, but I didn't. Instead, the idea came directly from the Augustine Committee, the group responsible for writing the National Academies of Science Gathering Storm Report, on which the bill before us today is based. Purportedly. In testimony before this committee in the 109th Congress, the only representative of the Augustine Committee to testify before this committee on ARPA-E concept said, and I quote, "In funding ARPA-E, it is critical that its funding not jeopardize the basic research supported by the Department of Energy's Office of Science. The committee's recommendations are priorities, and its top recommendation in the area of research is to increase the funding of basic research by 10% per year over the next 7 years. The Augustine Committee applauds the administration's American Competitive Initiative, particularly the courageous efforts of the Secretary of Energy's Samuel Bodman to make basic research activities a high priority in the Department of Energy budget. The Augustine report strongly recommends the support of ARPA-E come from new funding," end of quote. And that was testimony of Dr. Stephen Chu on behalf of the Augustine Committee. I don't think it can get any clearer than that. Supporting over 40% of the total federal funding for basic research in the physical sciences, more than any other federal agency, the DOE Office of Science is the nation's primary supporter of research in the physical sciences. The Office of Science has led the way in creating a unique system of large-scale specialized user facilities for scientific discovery. The collection of cutting-edge, often one-of-a-kind tools makes the Office of Science a unique and critical component of the federal science portfolio. Other federal science agencies, such as the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, greatly depend upon these Office of Science facilities in carrying out their own research activities. Under the President's fiscal year 2008 budget, 21,500 researchers would have access to these DOE facilities. Nearly half of those users will be university faculty and students. Many will be from other federal agencies, and a significant number will be from U.S. industry. Recognizing the importance and contributions of the DOE Office of Science, President Bush made doubling its budget one of the pillars of the ACI, and my Democrat colleagues, as I said before, made it a similar priority in their innovation agenda, proposing to double its funding in half the time that President Bush had proposed. But it was this committee that recognized the crucial role that the Office of Science played in our federal research portfolio long before it became part of any initiative or agenda of either party. This committee unanimously approved the provisions that became Title IX of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, including a provision that became Section 971 and authorized significant budget increases for the DOE Office of Science. And Congress approved these increases with broad bipartisan support, and they are now law. My amendment simply says that we should live up to the current law first, law we made in this committee. We've been told by the supporters of this bill that it's consistent with the recommendations of the Augustine Committee. We've also been told that the funding for ARPA-E will be new funding. We've heard this over and over in a recent hearing on ARPA-E during the subcommittee markup of this bill, and again today. Well, if my colleagues who support the bill are being honest with those of us who are skeptical that there are billions of dollars in new money to create another bureaucracy within the DOE, then they should support this amendment. By supporting this amendment, we're not saying we shouldn't create ARPA-E. Rather, by supporting this amendment, we're voting to reaffirm the priorities established in the Augustine report. We're voting to make federal funding for basic research a priority over funding for an idea to create a new bureaucracy. By supporting this amendment, we're voting to ensure that money for this new bureaucracy doesn't come at the expense of our basic research programs. It's a simple decision, really. What are our priorities? So I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Very briefly, the gentlelady's good faith amendment would require that the Office of Science have a 20.5% increase next year, 20.5% increase before ARPA-E could take effect. That's simply not realistic and is a killer amendment for this bill. If there's no
Mr. Chairman, I would ask for a roll call vote.
Chairman Gordon. Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall votes no. Mr. Wu. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Mr. Lampson. Mr. Lampson votes no. Ms. Giffords. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Kanjorski. Ms. Hooley. Ms. Hooley votes no. Mr. Roth. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Malasa. Mr. Malasa. Mr. Malasa votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roy Bacher. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Bonner. Mr. Bonner votes aye. Mr. Feeney. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes no. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. Diaz-Bolart. Aye. Mr. Diaz-Bolart votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye.
There are members that have not cast a vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 11 members vote aye and 19 members vote no.
The amendment is not agreed to. The fifth amendment on the roster is offered by the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Biggert. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364 offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try again. This is another very straightforward amendment. It strikes a provision added during subcommittee markup that limits to 8% the amount of ARPA-E project funds that can be allocated to federally funded research and development centers, or FFRDCs. This 8% cap, I think, is absolutely arbitrary. The Gathering Storm report said nothing about an 8% cap. Instead, it included language to the contrary, and I quote, "Solutions will require coordinated efforts among industrial, academic, and government laboratories," end quote. And that one of ARPA-E's purported benefits will be to, and I quote, "foster consortia of companies, colleges, and universities and laboratories to work on critical research problems," end quote. Nor do I recall a single witness who testified before this committee, either in the 109th Congress or more recently before the Energy and Environment subcommittees, ever suggesting, much less advocating, that we should tie the hands of program managers by limiting to 8% the amount of ARPA-E funds available to FFRDCs. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't recall a single one. Dr. Stephen Chu, the only member of the Augustine Committee to actually testify before this committee about ARPA, recommended neither an 8% cap nor tying the hands of the program managers in this way. And he also, as a matter of fact, said quite the opposite. Quote, "This agency would itself perform no research but would fund work conducted by universities, startup, established firms, and national laboratories." And he went on to say, anyone could compete for funding from ARPA-E, including universities, industry, businesses, and national laboratories, or ideally a consortium of these agencies. So while a member of the Augustine Committee gave this committee clear guidance, the bill before us does exactly the opposite of what was advised. Instead of empowering program managers to be independent, the bill ties the hands of program managers before the agency even exists by telling them how and where they can spend ARPA funds. Instead of favoring one group over another, the bill contains an arbitrary limitation that places one group at a disadvantage compared to the others. And if you think this arbitrary funding limitation only applies to DOE national laboratories, you would be mistaken. The list of FFRDCs is actually maintained by the National Science Foundation, and by the latest count, there are actually 37 different FFRDCs spread across the 9 different departments, including the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, NSF, and NASA. All are eligible for ARPA-E funding, but only 8% of it accorded to the bill, as reported by the subcommittee. I would ask these questions of my colleagues from Arizona, California, Colorado, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Illinois, New Jersey, Tennessee, and Washington, all of which are home to FFRDCs, And are you sure that none of the scientists or engineers at the FFRDCs in your state have an idea for solving our nation's national energy challenges? Are you sure that an 8% cap isn't going to prevent them from getting funding from ARPA for this, for that great idea? And are you willing to risk tying the hands of ARPA-E program managers in such a way as to preclude them from funding that great idea? If you're not, you should support this amendment. Eliminate the cap in the funding available to the FFRDs. Make the ARPA program managers truly independent. Leave the funding decisions to them, and in doing so, you will ensure that this bill remains true to the National Academy's recommendation that ARPA-E be designed as a lean, effective, and agile, but largely independent organization. I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, just very briefly, she just strikes the 8% limitation. That's in line with the Gather and Storm recommendations. It's not fair to the labs. They ought to be able to fight for funds the same as universities or private companies do. I urge approval of the amendment. Yield back.
With all due respect, this is another killer amendment, and if there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment, say aye. Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it. And
Mr. Chairman, I would request a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon? No. Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello? Ms. Johnson? Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey? Mr. Udall? Mr. Udall votes no. Mr. Wu? Mr. Baird? No. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller? Mr. Lipinski? No. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Mr. Lampson? No. Mr. Lampson votes no. Ms. Giffords? Mr. McNerney? No. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Kanjorski? Ms. Hooley? Ms. Hooley votes no. Mr. Rothman? No. Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Honda? No. Mr. Honda votes no. Mr. Matheson? No. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Chandler? Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Carnahan? Mr. Masalan? Malasa? Mr. Malasa votes no. Mr. Hill? No. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell? No. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson? No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Lamar Smith? Mr. Roybacher? Mr. Bartlett? Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Ehlers? Mr. Ehlers votes no. Mr. Lucas? Mrs. Biggert? Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken? Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Bonner? Mr. Feeney? Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. Inglis? Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert votes aye. Mr. McCall? Mr. Diaz-Bolart? Mr. Diaz-Bolart votes aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith? Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye.
Are there any members who have not been recorded?
Mr. Costello has not voted. No. Mr. Costello votes no.
Let's go to that side now.
Mr. Bonner has not voted. Mr. Bonner votes aye.
Giffords.
No. Mrs. Giffords is not recorded. Ms. Giffords votes no.
Mr. Wu? Mr. Wu?
Mr. Wu is not recorded.
Mr.
Mr. Wu votes no.
Mr. Inglis?
Mr. Inglis is not recorded. Mr. Inglis votes aye.
Mr. Carnahan?
Mr. Carnahan is not recorded. Mr. Carnahan votes no.
Mr. McCall?
Mr. McCall is not recorded. Mr. McCall votes aye.
Mr. Nagelbauer?
Mr. Nagelbauer is not recorded. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye.
Rohrbacher?
Mr. Roy Barker votes aye.
She's writing it. Okay. Report the vote. When she gets it.
Mr. Chairman, 13 members vote aye, 23 vote no.
The amendment fails. The sixth amendment on the roster is offered by the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Biggert. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment? Well, let me ask the gentlelady, does she have any more amendments? And if so, please tell us which one it
No,
might be.
no, Mr. Chairman, two's enough.
Okay, Mr. Ehlers.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, just at some point I would like to know why these are killer amendments, but we can discuss that later.
At the appropriate time, I'll be happy to tell you.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Ehlers is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364 offered by Mr. Ehlers of Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the Gathering Storm report initially suggested creating DARPA-E, I was very, very skeptical about it. I wasn't sure that it would work, and I thought the current Office of Science could take on that responsibility. What has changed my mind, and I now support it, is just thinking back historically through the history of the Department of Energy. It has been plagued at various times by secretaries of energy who were purely political appointees, who knew very little about science or about the operation of the department. And as a result of considering that historical record, I decided it's very important that we return back to what the Gathering Storm report originally recommended, and that is that DARPA-E report to the Undersecretary for Science rather than to the Secretary. I believe it's very important that the agency report to someone who is a scientist, has a scientific background, and can properly defend their requests to the Department of Management and Budget, or the Office of Management and Budget, and to the President. And so I am offering an amendment to return the reporting line to what was recommended in the Gathering Storm report, largely on the historical basis of how the department has been run and how it has had hills and valleys over the years. As I mentioned earlier, just pointing back to the decade of the 90s, there was a series of secretaries who had very little or if any knowledge of science and certainly did not do a very good job of operating the department or setting priorities. Now that the Energy Policy Act of 2005 elevated the position of the Director of the Office of Science to the Undersecretary level, providing the Undersecretary the necessary authority to promote the role of science and technology research and development at the department, I am convinced that it would be better for the ARPA-E agency to report to the Undersecretary for Science rather than to the Secretary. And I feel very strongly about that. In addition, my argument is strengthened by the fact that Mr. Augenstein and the Gathering Storm Report recommended the same thing. I believe that creating a new agency focused explicitly on the development of innovative energy technologies and putting it outside the science missions of the department underlines the authority of the Undersecretary for Science. In fact, the authors of the Gathering Storm, in their recommendation, included in their recommendation that the Director of ARPA-E report to that Undersecretary, definitely not to the Secretary of Energy. So I strongly urge the adoption of this. I think it will improve the bill and will make it a more workable agency as a result. We've said a lot here this morning about bureaucrats, getting bureaucrats out of the way. I think in view of the fact that we want to avoid bureaucracy, it's best to have them reporting directly to a scientist rather than to a secretary who is frequently not a scientist. I want to make clear that my comments here do not refer to the current Secretary of Energy, who I think is one of the best we've had in a long time. I certainly appreciate Secretary Bodman's work, but we have an outstanding Undersecretary of Science in Dr. Raymond Orbach, who is a proven record as both a scientist and as an administrator. And so at this point especially, this would be good, but I think if you look at the historical record, you will also agree it's best to have the agency report to the Undersecretary of Science. I yield back the balance.
The gentleman yield.
Yes, be happy to yield.
Let me say to the gentleman, there's no question this is a good faith amendment, and we did not receive it until this afternoon. Or yesterday, was it yesterday? We recently received it. The original purpose of going to, reporting to the Secretary was to try to get away from bureaucracy, to go to the head of the stream so you wouldn't get into any of that. I still think that's probably a good idea. I'm going to oppose this amendment today, but I want to continue to talk with the gentleman as we go through this process. I may be wrong, but on short notice, I think it does streamline it, and I think it's better to go directly to it. And so I will oppose it. But as I say, I think this is a discussion that we need to continue to have. And so, as has been earlier said, I reluctantly oppose what I know is a good faith amendment.
Well, reclaiming my time, I appreciate those comments. I would point out that it was the amendment was submitted at 9 a.m. on Tuesday. We thought that would be adequate time. And I think it's not only a good faith amendment, but it's a good amendment. And so I would appreciate everyone's vote on this particular amendment.
Is there further discussion on the amendment?
I would just note that Dr. Ehlers is highly respected in terms of his understanding of science and how science works and how it works in this system, and I will be supporting him in that. And when we're talking, his whole theory is let's get make sure that a scientist is someone who's being reported to, and of course we have a disagreement between the scientists. And Mr. Chairman, I don't believe that you are a scientist, so I'll be siding with the scientist.
Well, if the gentleman yield, I do know that there's a disagreement between the Undersecretary Scientist and the Secretary. I know who's going to win that one. So, with no further discussion, I guess there is a further discussion. Ms. Biggert's recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Ladies recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. I couldn't agree more with my colleague, Dr. Ehlers, and I think in the conjunction with Senator Domenici and Senator Bigeman and Secretary Bodman, I worked very hard during the conference on the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to create the position of Undersecretary of Science at the Department of Energy, and I think that this organizational structure is working to bridge the gap between fundamental discoveries and their applied use. Dr. Ray Orbach, the former director of the Office of Science and the first to fill this position, made a point to get quickly up to speed on applied energy technology programs as soon as he assumed the position of Undersecretary. and why, and that was to make sure that the department's basic research programs were helping the applied energy programs overcome fundamental technical obstacles to the development and deployment of advanced energy technologies. I think the Augustine Committee recognized how important this organizational change was at DOE, and that's why they were explicit that the director of ARPA-E should report to the Undersecretary of Science. And in my opinion, the Gathering Storm report wasn't clear about a lot of things, but the witnesses at our subcommittee hearing last month generally agreed that ARPA-E recommendation was more vague, but this is one of the things that was quite clear in the report. It's even in the very first sentence, the action item at the beginning of the recommendation. So this bill essentially creates, without it, another stovepipe within the DOE by keeping ARPA-E totally autonomous from the department's basic and applied research programs, creating an unnecessary bureaucracy. So one way to avoid the stovepipe effect is for the director to report to the Undersecretary of Science, and I would urge you, to work with Dr. Ehlers, and I would yield to Dr. Ehlers.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding, and I apologize to the chairman if you did not see the amendment in time to give it adequate consideration. I don't. My goal is not to embarrass you by defeating you here, and I don't even know if I could. But if you sincerely believe it would be better to offer it as a manager's amendment on the floor, or some other assurance that this will receive consideration there, or in the Rules Committee, that's certainly an option. But otherwise, lacking any assurances of that, then I would like to proceed to a vote here. So I'd appreciate your reaction to that. I certainly am not trying to stir the pot or upset your game. I just want fair consideration.
If the gentleman would yield, clearly, you have nothing but the best intentions. And I'm sure if the amendment was filed by you, it is an error on our part by not getting it this early. I cannot promise to you that we will make this change. Only that we will consider it as we go forward. Again, my feeling is that to help reduce the bureaucracy by reporting directly to the secretary, you're going to have less bureaucracy. And as a practical matter, the secretary is going to overrule any undersecretary if they're not happy with it. So, but I think it is well to discuss it more. I don't want to mislead you into thinking that this is automatically going to be a part of a manager's amendment later. So, I would suggest if you want to vote today, you should have a vote, because I can't make that promise.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I recognize you can't make that promise, but I don't want to take the time for a roll call vote if, in fact, we are going to continue our discussions on this.
Chairman Deal?
Yes, I'd be happy to yield.
Do you think this is more of a killer amendment than Ms. Biggart's are?
No, it's not.
All right.
No, it's a good faith effort.
Then I recommend passage of the amendment.
Is there further discussion? If there's no further discussion, then the vote is on Mr. Ehlers' amendment. All in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. It appears the noes have it, but if there's... Okay, would you like to have you want to have a show of hands? What would you like to do?
Show of hands is adequate, I believe.
Okay.
As long as we can each count.
All right. That's a big assumption here, but those in favor, please raise your hand. Let me just see what I got. I get 15. All opposed, say, raise your hand. And I believe there's 21. If there's no disagreement, then the amendment failed. The eighth amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbrey. Are you ready to proceed? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 360.
Chairman, I move that the unanimous consent of the amendment be accepted as read.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, it is quite clear that the intent here is to create a $14 billion new vehicle. All my bill does is strike that money, basically places us in a position of making some priority decisions here. Do we want to create this new vehicle? Do we want to have it separate and isolated? And basically says that there are some priority decisions got to be made, and those priority decisions, I think, up front ought to be that DOE, the Office of Science, is going to be impacted one way or the other. The people that just developed the new lithium battery that is not toxic, can handle high energy without creating hazardous problems in the future, that we need to make some priority decisions, and this bill just basically strikes the funding for the new agency and the new group, and basically says that in the tradition of the 1990s, when we required that if you wanted to create something new and add something new, you had to find the money within the existing structure. My motion basically does that, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbrey. I would just quickly say that the Bilbrey amendment would eliminate funding for ARPA-E, effectively killing the program. And if there's no further discussion...
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Robracher is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would suggest that if Mr. Bilbrey's amendment is adopted, that it will not kill the idea, that instead it will force us to set the priorities that we're supposed to set. If the argument in favor of ARPA-E is that the status quo currently going on is not an efficient use of resources and thus a restructuring is necessary, we should have the courage enough to say what programs are not an efficient use of the money and what in the status quo isn't worthy of financing, and use that money to finance ARPA-E. Should Mr. Bilbrey's amendment not be accepted, I would, of course, be planning to move forward on the floor with an amendment that will accomplish just that. If we do believe that this is a necessary restructuring, we should have the courage to say why it's necessary by eliminating those things that are costing money, that aren't cost effective, that are currently being spent on. And this idea of just shoving it off to the oil companies, which I again voted against that particular subsidy, tax incentive subsidy, but that's just a way of getting around trying to set priorities and doing the tough job that we're supposed to do here. So I would suggest Mr. Bilbrey's amendment is going in the right direction and forcing us to try to set priorities and get rid of failing programs if indeed the status quo isn't working, which is the premise of this whole argument, and I support that, by the way. I support that concept. Let's have courage enough to defund those projects that aren't working.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbrey. Mr. Robracher, I'm afraid there won't be a majority courage to get that done. And so if there's no further discussion, all in favor of the amendment, say aye. All opposed, say no. No. The noes have it. The Ninth Amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364 offered by Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, my amendment would transfer all of the funds, the relevant funds and projects to the appropriate programs at DOE. If a study required under Section 1821 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 concludes that ARPA-E should not be established, the study mandated under Section 1821 of EPACT would look at the applicability of the management practices used by the Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, to research programs at the Department of Energy and the advisability of creating an agency within DOE modeled after DARPA. The National Academy of Public Administration, an independent and nonpartisan organization, I would emphasize an independent and nonpartisan organization, is charged with carrying out this study. Mr. Chairman, I'm extremely concerned about the creation of a new bureaucracy and possible waste of taxpayer dollars should ARPA-E be established without fully addressing whether this new agency is the most effective tool for delivering new technologies to the marketplace. Therefore, I believe it would be beneficial to have the Academy of Public Administration's recommendation on whether it is even advisable to create a new agency. Should the Academy's findings reflect negatively on the establishment of ARPA-E, the agency would be terminated and all funds would be directed to the appropriate programs with the Department of Energy. We've heard several times this morning that various amendments may be killer amendments. Certainly this one is not a killer amendment. It simply defers to an independent, nonpartisan organization for their recommendations. Also, I would suggest that the approach of a new agency, perhaps taking dollars from other projects, is indeed a continuation of the status quo. I hope that this inclusion of an independent organization's opinion would lead to favorable public policy and wise use of taxpayer dollars. I yield back.
With all due respect, let me repeat what I said earlier. I mean, again, this is a killer amendment. The reason it is a killer amendment, this same amendment was passed by the Congress, signed by the President, requiring the Department of Education to do this study and send it to Congress by January of 2007. The Department of Energy has yet to even put it out for study. So if you're going to, and this was one of Mr. Hall's big shalls, the department shall do that, but they did not do it. They didn't do it then. There's no reason to think they're going to do it again. And so this is a killer amendment. And again, it's a demonstration of ineptitude, I think, within the Department of Energy when they are flaunting themselves and not doing the will of the Congress. Mr. Bilbrey.
Mr. Chairman, correct me if I'm wrong, but the gentleman from Nebraska has given you, you say, let's jump, let's move now, and he's creating a parachute for you that says only if it's a long fall, only if the report comes out and says there's a problem, the fact is if you're saying the study doesn't come out, doesn't say it's a problem, it's going to kill the bill, he's giving you a safety valve, but the fact is if the experts in the field come back after we've moved ahead and says, you got major problems, that gives you a fallback to say, okay, let's do a rethink, but only if they come out and say that, not beforehand. So in all fairness, I think the gentleman from Nebraska has tried to be more than accommodating to your original legislation, but creates a safety escape hatch in case the people on the front line say, this could be a major disaster. And so it actually could reinforce your argument for moving forward now because you do have that parachute in the back. So the gentleman from Nebraska seems like he's trying to accommodate your intention of moving forward while still guaranteeing some protection for the taxpayers and for the consumer that needs this technology moving forward. Now, yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, you're saying it's not a killer, it just allows the program to move forward, don't you?
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Rothman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to respond to my distinguished colleagues' remarks on the other side, sometimes, as we all know, people of goodwill in positions of power use their positions to thwart opposing ideologies or opposing approaches to problems simply by various means, including delay, passive aggression, whatever you want to call it. And I think what our chairman has indicated is that the Department of Energy has used its power to thwart reforms in the past, even those directed by the Congress, through delay. And so while one may view the gentleman's amendment as simply an opportunity to provide for what he describes as a parachute, or it has been described as a parachute, in the eyes of others would simply be enabling an agency of this administration that has resisted the will and thwarted the will of the Congress to deny them an opportunity to do so again. So I would respectfully oppose this amendment.
If there's no, Ms. Smith's recognized.
Move to strike the last word. I would point out that if there's a delay of the study, this agency continues. I mean, I think I heard the chairman say that the department has delayed various studies and so forth. If that takes place, this new agency continues. And it's only if the study takes place and finds very objectively that the agency is unnecessary and that taxpayer dollars could be better spent elsewhere, then the dollars could be spent elsewhere in accordance with the study.
If the gentleman would yield?
Yes.
I thank the gentleman. Is it the usual occurrence when a new project is suggested to begin that at the same time funds are authorized to then study whether the project was worthwhile?
Well, oftentimes projects have sunset clauses. Mine is basically only a sunset if the study concludes that it should sunset. Otherwise, it continues indefinitely.
If the gentleman would continue to yield.
Certainly.
I think that, one might argue that in which branch of government the decision about whether to continue a program should continue, and to leave it in the hands of this administration to decide that a congressionally authorized and approved program must end, I think would be the wrong approach. I think certainly if the administration, for whatever reason, presented evidence to the Congress that something we were doing here in the Congress was wasteful or wrong, the majority of us on each side of the aisle would respond appropriately. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I appreciate your concern. I would say from my experience in public policy that a lot of new programs are started with the best of intentions and are continued with more and more dollars with newly developed constituencies, perhaps hijacking various programs. I'm not accusing this project immediately of such violations. I would say, however, deferring to the independent organization, such as the Academy of Public Administrators, a very well-respected organization that does a very nice job of staying above the political fray, especially in a partisan manner, that getting their input on this is wise and I think very appropriate. I yield back.
If there's no further discussion, the vote is on the gentleman from Nebraska's amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The no.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for a recorded vote, please.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Gordon.
No.
Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Mr. Lampson. Mr. Lampson votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Kenjorski. Ms. Hooley. Ms. Hooley votes no. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher? Mr. Roybacher votes no. Mr. Bartlett? Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Ehlers? Mr. Ehlers votes no. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mrs. Biggert? Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken? Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Bonner? Mr. Bonner votes aye. Mr. Feeney? Mr. Feeney votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. Inglis? Mr. Inglis votes no. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert votes aye. Mr. McCall? Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Bolart? Mr. Diaz-Bolart votes aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith? Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye.
Any members not recorded? The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 13 members vote aye, 25 vote no.
The amendment is not carried. The 10th Amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364 offered by Mr. Gingrey of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. If you didn't like the amendment submitted by the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, you're going to really hate this one, Mr. Chairman. But I think it's an amendment that maybe is more logical to all of the members on both sides of the aisle. Basically, EPAC 2005, Energy Policy Act 2005, in Section 1821, that's why it's so similar to Mr. Smith's amendment, call for the study to ask the question, would ARPA-E, we were playing with those acronyms a little earlier, but the Advanced Project Research Act under the Department of Energy, would it fit? Would it be as successful as the DARPA program under the Department of Defense, which of course has existed for 50 years or more and has a fantastic track record? I submit, Mr. Chairman, that maybe it is not analogous to that program in that under DARPA there is a ready-made customer, and of course that's our military. In many of the studies that are done by DARPA, there is this opportunity to immediately apply technology to the field, if you will. But that's not actually the way it would occur with a similar program under the Department of Energy. There may be no market, and I suggest that for that reason that a study before we authorize $5 billion over 5 years for a new program, that this study under Section 1821 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 is supposed to be done, in fact, 5 months ago, January of '07, and that this is the right way to do things. This is the right way to spend the people's money to make sure that just a few pages out of a very thick volume, the Rise of the Gathering Storm report, which doesn't really get very specific. So I think it's very appropriate in EP Act 2005 that this study be done before we go ahead and spend the money. That's how my amendment, Mr. Chairman, is different from the Smith amendment. His amendment says, well, you go ahead and start the program, you start the funding, and if and when the study finally gets done and it shows that it's not a worthwhile project, then you stop the funding. My amendment simply says you don't start the funding until you do the study. If you go ahead and start the program without the study, it's like scheduling a wedding before you've picked the bride and groom.
So I think it's just a very logical amendment, and it's a common sense, fiscally responsible amendment. I don't mind seeing government grow if there's a good reason for it, but I think that the study should be done before we start spending the money, and I'll yield back my time.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Actually, you just conditioned establishment of ARPA-E on a positive recommendation that was made in the Energy Policy Act, right?
That is correct, Mr. Hall.
Yeah. I urge the adoption of the amendment.
Well, I'll be very brief and say that the gentleman, my friend from Georgia, correctly described my view of this amendment. I mean, it's. We've talked about this a lot, so I'm sorry to be repetitious on this. But keep in mind, the Department of Energy, by law, passed by Congress, signed by the President, was required, with a big shall, was required to do this study and present it to Congress. I have written them myself asking for it. They have not even commissioned it. I mean, that is, is just not a credible approach. And so, if there's no further discussion, we will have a vote on the amendment. All in favor of Mr. Gingri's amendment, say aye. Opposed, nay. Nay.
Mr. Chairman, could I have a recorded vote? Thank you.
The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon.
No.
Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Mr. Lampson. Mr. Lampson votes no. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Kenjorski. Ms. Hooley. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes no. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Bonner. Mr. Bonner votes aye. Mr. Feeney. Mr. Feeney votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. English. Mr. English votes no. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Bolart. Mr. Diaz-Bolart votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray votes aye. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye.
Any members not recorded? Dr. Ehlers.
Mr. Ehlers is not recorded. Mr. Ehlers votes no.
Any other members hiding here? Okay. The clerk will report the vote. If with no with no objection, since the vote has not been recorded yet, we will allow gentlelady from Oregon to vote.
Ms. Cooley votes no.
Okay. Once again, is there any other? The clerk will report. Just double checking. I want to get.
Mr. Chairman, 13 members vote aye, 24 members vote no.
Amendment fails. The 11th amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Aiken. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman, and I have to say to start out, the whole idea of Arby's...
If I could, if you don't mind, Mr. Aiken, the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364 offered by Mr. Aiken of Missouri.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I was inclined to really like your bill because I like Arby's. I get roast beef sandwiches and milkshakes there, and I thought it was going to be a pretty good thing. But now I understand we got a $4.9 billion program going to run for 5 years. And, Mr. Chairman, my amendment simply says at the end of 5 years, we're going to sunset. In other words, we're going to take a look, and if the program did what you want it to do, then we could proceed. If it suggests that maybe it should be folded into a different agency or bureau or something like that, we could make those changes. But we just take a good look at it. My impression, Mr. Chairman, is that 5 years or 4 years or 3 years, even 1 year from this day, there is no one in this committee to even remember we did this other than perhaps you as chairman. And so 5 years out, I think maybe this thing could take a review. We would then assess whether it's really worked or not. So, Mr. Chairman, it just seems to me to make sense. Why not subject it to a review 5 years out? I just want to know if I would yield to you what you think about that idea.
Thank you. I hope our kids will remember this, and I hope they'll remember it gratefully and fondly. Let me respond by saying the current bill already states that after 54 months, not 60, but after 54 months, the President's Committee on Science and Technology will evaluate ARPA-E and include a recommendation on whether it should be continued or terminated. Congress then can act on that recommendation.
So you're assuming it's going to be continued unless it's terminated?
No. We're saying that
well, if we didn't take any action on their recommendation, then it would continue.
Yes,
right?
Yes. I think it leaves it again stated clearly. After 54 months, the President's Committee on Science and Technology will evaluate ARPA-E and include a recommendation on whether it should be continued or terminated. Congress can then act on the recommendation.
Well, my amendment would have been the converse, that we would stop it unless we thought it were good. Now, I assume that you would really like that idea more than this other approach. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman?
I think the appropriate approach is, again, after 54 months, having a thorough review by a qualified operation.
Mr. Chairman, if I could interrupt, am I reading between the lines that you probably wouldn't support my amendment?
Yeah, you're very insightful.
And being a person of some statistical savvy and seeing how the previous votes are gone, would it be all right if I don't ask for a roll call vote?
I would add to those accolades courteous, too.
Yeah. Then, Mr. Chairman, I would, unless there's further discussion, proceed to a voice vote and move on with the day.
All in favor of the...
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Robacher is recognized.
I just want to make sure I'm on the record of supporting Mr. Aiken's amendment because even though I'm very supportive of this concept of ARPA-E, I think that it is incumbent upon us to say that we will have to reaffirm that this program is working after a given time period, 60 months, a good time period suggests 5 years, that we should have to make a positive act to reaffirm that this deserves the taxpayers' money and is an effective restructuring that's taken place. So I would think Mr. Aiken's suggestion is a very, very positive one. And if we really believe in what we're doing, this is exactly the type of measure that we should have in all of the changes that we make. That we have to reaffirm that they've been positive changes, or that they go on out of existence. Thank you very much.
If the gentleman, very quickly, this really, we are trying to accomplish the same thing, and that there should be a review. I think we are looking at it in a real political sense. Right now, as you very well know, we could have a majority of the Congress that thinks this is a good program. But if one person in the Senate decides to put a hold, and we have to make an affirmative vote, that vote may never come up. Even if it's not one with a hold, less than a majority can stop something from coming up there. So it's just, again, we're trying to accomplish the same thing in that clearly if it's not a good bill and a good program, it should stop, just like the managers have the authority, if there is a specific research program that's going on, to terminate it. But I think the political reality is that a majority of Congress can support this program, yet the will of that majority might not be heard. So if there's no further discussion, all in favor of the gentleman's amendment, say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Nay. The amendment fails.
I am, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for extending the courtesy to allow me to speak for the gentleman from Florida. The amendment simply... oh, yeah, please.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364 offered by Mr. McCall.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply sunsets RPE after 5 years if importation of foreign energy sources is not reduced by at least 5%. A reduction of 5% is a modest and very achievable goal. If the goal is not reached, if the goal is reached, then RPE would be sunsetted after 10 years if importation of foreign energy sources is not reduced by at least 20%. Mr. Chairman, this amendment just reinstates the goals of the original bill before that language was removed at the subcommittee markup 2 weeks ago. This reduction would be certified by the Undersecretary of Energy of Science in coordination with the Energy Information Administration. I'm concerned that we are creating a brand new billion-dollar agency without any form of accountability. This amendment simply gives this new agency clear and measurable goals. It establishes benchmarks that are consistent with one of the main goals of the program to reduce America's dependence on foreign sources of energy. It holds the program accountable for tangible results and protects the taxpayers from unnecessary and wasteful spending. And with that, I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If not, all those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The clerk the clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon. Chairman Gordon votes no. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Wu. No. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Baird. No. Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Miller. No. Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski. No. Mr. Lipinski votes no. Mr. Lampson. No. Mr. Lampson votes no. Ms. Giffords. Mr. McNerney. No. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Kanjorski. Ms. Hooley. Ms. Hooley votes no. Mr. Rothman. No. Mr. Rothman votes no. Mr. Honda. Mr. Matheson. No. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Ross. No. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes no. Mr. Carnahan. No. Mr. Carnahan votes no. Mr. Melanson. No. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Hill. Yes. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. No. Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mrs. Biggert. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Bonner. Mr. Bonner votes aye. Mr. Feeney. Mr. Feeney votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes no. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert votes aye. Mr. McCall.
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Bolart. Mr. Diaz-Bolart votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes aye.
How is the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Giffords, recorded?
Ms. Giffords is not recorded. Ms. Giffords votes no.
And the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 12 members vote aye, 23 vote no.
Amendment fails. The 13th amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 364 offered by Mr. Gingrey of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I won't take 5 minutes. This is a friendly amendment. I hope the chairman and the majority members, as well as the minority, will like this amendment. It's a little misleading. It says inserts a savings clause. Typically, when you talk about savings, you're talking about cutting something. In this instance, of course, Mr. Chairman, it basically says that the authorities granted by this act are in addition to the existing authorities granted to the Secretary of Energy and not intended to supersede or modify any existing authorities. In other words, want to make sure that the programs are good programs within the Department of Energy, the Office of Science. We all agree, I think, that Secretary Bodman is doing an outstanding job. We don't want to cut into the muscle of programs that are already working well, and make sure that the language is clear that this is an additional program and not to take away from existing programs.
Mr. Gingrey, I think this is lucky 13, and it's appropriate that we conclude our amendments today with, I hope, what will be a unanimous vote for your amendment. And let me point out that I know that the minority was not successful on a variety of amendments today, but they were also successful on some earlier. There were lots of discussions, lots of the suggestions were put into this bill, so do not think this is not, this bill has lots of mothers and fathers. And so with that, I will call
Mr.
vote.
Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Robacher.
Hate to be the skunk at the lawn party here, but
Well, you have before, so go ahead.
it isn't unanimous. This is exactly the wrong way to go. This is exactly the wrong way to go. If we're saying that the current structure does not work, we should not be saying that the current structure will not be touched, and this is just an addition. So we're just adding more spending onto something that's failed. If it's failed and we need something else, we need restructuring, let's take it from where it's failed. And again, I will have to say that I agree with the concept of restructuring, creating an ARPA-E, because I don't believe the current system is working. It is overly bureaucratic. It is overly, what we have is an old boy network spread throughout the scientific community on energy research. We need to break through that and to have some real reform here. Just suggesting that we're not going to touch the system as
If the gentleman will yield.
is counter to what we're trying to do here. So I oppose this.
If the gentleman will yield to me, Mr. Robacher. And I thank the gentleman for yielding. And let me just say that, the final vote here in committee has not been taken on this bill, and I, at the outset, suggested that maybe this program was not needed.
And I still feel that way, and that will become obvious when the final vote is taken. Although I have great respect for our chairman, and most of the time I'm going to be supportive of much of his legislation, as I have been so far in the 110th. But what this amendment basically says is if this bill does pass, which I think those of us on this side of the aisle can count, it very likely will pass, but in that event, I certainly don't want to have this funding to cut into the meat of the overall Department of Energy budget. That's the reason.
Well, that's clearly your intent, and that's clearly the wrong direction to go. And I'm sorry if you've got a reason to create restructuring within the Department of Energy, we should be restructuring it by defunding those things that aren't working well, and not just adding more spending onto programs that have failed. So I would.
Well, gentlemen,
I just want to be on the record.
Sure. If it's a gentleman from California, let me suggest that you don't smell quite as bad as you point out. In that we're not doing our job. I think there are probably some things at the Department of Energy that aren't as good as they should be. Right. We're not doing our job here in oversight if we don't look into that. And I think that as this committee, I don't want to acquiesce that. We should look at it. If there's some things that aren't being good, it's our job to point it out and do something about it. And I hope that we will do that.
Thank you.
And so. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The ayes have it. Are there other amendments? If not, then the vote is on the bill. H.R. 364 as amended. All in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman from Texas asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will read the vote. Read the roll.
Chairman Gordon.
Aye.
Chairman Gordon votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes aye. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes aye. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Mr. Lampson. Mr. Lampson votes aye. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Kanjorski. Ms. Hooley. Ms. Hooley votes aye. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Rothman votes aye. Mr. Honda. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes aye. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Lamar Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes aye. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes no. Mr. Bonner. Mr. Bonner votes no. Mr. Feeney. Mr. Feeney votes no. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Inglis votes aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Diaz-Bolart. Mr. Diaz-Bolart votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Adrian Smith. Mr. Adrian Smith votes no.
Are there other members that were not recorded? If not, the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 25 members vote aye and 12 members vote no.
The bill passes. Mr. Hall recognizes.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for the way you've conducted this, and as the gentleman, Mr. Dr. Gingrich said, we can count, and we could count each of these times, and actually about the only excitement we've had here today is when Miss Deborah would call for the gentleman from Louisiana to vote. But we like the direction we're going. We don't like the fact that you have another agency, the money expended, but we thank you for your courtesy and your generosity and the way you handle the gavel. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I wish this could have been a unanimous vote, but it was a unanimous work in that both at the subcommittee level, working together all through, I think that we have a better bill, and I'm glad it's a bipartisan bill, and I want Dr. Ehlers and anyone else to know that we will continue a conversation to have the very best bill we can through going to the floor and going through conference. And now I recognize Ms. Johnson. Okay. Thank you. Now I recognize Mr. Lamson to offer a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 364 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that the staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and make the necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration.
Questions on the motion to report the bill favorably? Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move the members have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. I move, pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22 of the Rules of the House of Representatives, that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to adopt and pass H.R. 364 to provide for the establishment of the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy as amended. Without objection, so ordered. And once again, I want to thank members for your patience. I know there are lots of markups going on. We have 3 more bills, which I hope will be unanimous, and we will now proceed to those. We will now consider H.R. 1467, the 10,000 Trained by 2010 Act. I yield the chairman of the Technology and Innovation Subcommittee, Mr. Wu, 5 minutes to describe the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We've had a busy morning, and I shall be as quick as possible. Other members of this committee and I have been working on the issue of healthcare IT for 2 years. The genesis of H.R. 1467 was a roundtable I held in Oregon in August of 2005. This roundtable was followed by an Environment, Standards, and Technology Subcommittee field hearing on healthcare information technology in February of 2006. Representative Reichert chaired the hearing, and Ranking Member Hall also had staff in attendance. One of the common issues raised at both of these events was the lack of training for folks who are experts in both healthcare and in IT. Despite the federal focus on developing a national electronic healthcare record system, there is no systematic plan for the training of current and prospective professionals in both healthcare and in IT. And without this, without folks who are both expert in both fields, we run a serious risk of having boxes and software sit on desks unlit and unused. The need for individuals to manage healthcare IT is expected to grow 49% between 2000 and 2010, and nearly 75% of healthcare organizations indicate there are not enough qualified applicants to fill open healthcare management positions. H.R. 1467 is intended to keep the lights on at these organizations and focus on addressing this specific educational gap. I would like to point out the Science and Technology Committee has a history of developing specific training and research programs for IT professionals. During the 107th Congress, the committee became concerned that the lack of specialized computer security training for IT students and professionals was a contributing factor in the lack of good computer security practices and software. As a result, this committee developed and moved H.R. 3394, the Cybersecurity Research and Development Act, which vested such programs at the National Science Foundation and subsequently became Public Law 107-305. H.R. 1467 consists of 4 components. It authorizes the National Science Foundation to award research grants for innovative approaches to enhancing software informatics. I want to make clear and emphasize that this provision builds upon existing NSF activities. It authorizes NSF to support multidisciplinary health and medical informatics research centers to perform research and to train qualified healthcare informatics personnel and professionals. It authorizes NSF to establish a grant program to improve undergraduate, master's, and certificate programs in healthcare informatics. The goal is to increase the number of students and the quality of their training in the field. This program allows both 4-year and 2-year institutions to participate, as well as allowing for the development of continuing education curricula. And finally, it authorizes NSF's Advanced Technology Education Program, which focuses solely on 2-year colleges to support improved education and technical training for healthcare informatics. H.R. 1467 is a bipartisan product of this committee. Then Chairman Hall and I introduced this bill in the last Congress. This Congress, we reintroduced this bill along with Chairman Gordon and Ranking Member Gingrey of the Technology and Innovation Subcommittee. I've spoken to Dr. Gingrey about healthcare IT, and he knows firsthand the challenges involved in integrating IT into medical settings. We all recognize the benefits that an integrated healthcare IT network could provide in terms of improved patient care, safety, privacy, and potential cost savings. However, investment in physical infrastructure, software, and technology alone is not enough. We need research and to train healthcare and IT professionals to use and design the resulting systems well. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. It's not much. But seriously, thank you for your work in bringing this to us. I know you've been very tenacious about this, very committed to this, and we thank you. And now I recognize Mr. Hall for any remarks.
Mr. Chairman, as Mr. Wu has stated, several over here of us, I'm included in that, are original co-sponsors on this. We urge the adoption of it. And I recognize Mr. Gingrey. I yield to Mr. Gingrey the rest of
and I thank
my 15 minutes.
Thank the distinguished ranking member for yielding, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say that Chairman Wu pretty much summarized it. This issue of health information technology, electronic medical records, the President is so right in calling for fully integrated system by the year 2014, hopefully before then. And there was a RAND study, Mr. Chairman, that estimated that $160 billion a year could be saved from healthcare costs. We're spending about $2 trillion, I think, on an annual basis for healthcare. As we all know, probably 65–70% of that is federal government spending through our military and veterans and Medicare and Medicaid and the S-CHIP program. So this is hugely important. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor in working with David and you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Hall. So I'll yield back, but I just want to enthusiastically support the bill 1467.
Thank you, Mr. Gingrey. You're correct. There can be billions of dollars of savings here, but let me point out that we can't have the savings. We won't need the technicians until we have interoperability, until we have patient security, and that's what our Bill 2406 will provide. So these are going to work good together, and look forward to working with you on that. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? I ask unanimous consent. The bill is considered as read, and open to amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. Are there any amendments? Hearing none, the vote is on the bill. H.R. 1467. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. I recognize Mr. Hall to offer a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1467 to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration. I yield back.
Questions on the motion to report the bill favorably? Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move the members have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental minority or additional views on the measure. I move pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22 of the Rules of the House of Representatives that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to adopt and pass H.R. 1467, the 10,000 Train by 2010 Act. Without objection, so ordered. We will now consider, congratulations, Mr. Wu and Mr. Gingrey. We will now consider H.R. 1716, the Green Energy Education Act of 2007. I recognize Mr. McCall for 5 minutes to describe the bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first thank you for including my bill in today's markup and commend you for your bipartisan leadership on this committee. And I also want to thank Mr. Hill for working with me on this legislation. My hometown of Austin, Texas is a green energy kind of town, and I'm proud of that. Like many other members of this committee, I'm concerned about America's dependence on foreign sources of energy. One of the ways that we can reduce the need for energy imports is to use our energy more efficiently. Buildings consume more energy than any other sector of the economy, including industry and transportation. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, U.S. buildings consume 39% of our nation's primary energy and 70% of electricity. However, energy-efficient building practices are still at the fringes of the building sector, in part because of the lack of awareness about energy-efficient technologies and design practices among building professionals. That is why I introduced the Green Energy Education Act. This legislation authorizes the Department of Energy to partner with the National Science Foundation to support graduate education and curriculum development to advance DOE's broad energy technology development mission. Working through NSF, DOE will help develop the next generation of engineers and architects to produce buildings incorporating the latest in energy-efficient technologies. In order to reduce the likelihood of duplicative and wasteful programs, this bill allows the Department of Energy and National Science Foundation to combine their efforts to find workable solutions to the issues surrounding building efficiency that can be transferred to the marketplace. Specifically, H.R. 1716 will authorize DOE's Office of Science and Applied Energy Technology programs to contribute funds to NSF's successful integrative graduate education and research traineeship program, which is already doing great work in this area. This bill also authorizes the Department of Energy to contribute to NSF's curriculum development activities in order to improve the ability of engineers and architects to design and construct more efficient and durable buildings. I urge my colleagues to support this important step towards increasing America's energy independence, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall, and thank you for bringing us a good bill. We will get this to the floor at the earliest possible time. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with the amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1716 offered by Mr. McCall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
And I won't take nearly that amount of time. It's a very simple amendment that clarifies that landscape architects will be eligible for the programs created in this bill. By designing the environment around a building with the goal of energy efficiency in mind, landscape architects have helped find new and innovative ways of reducing energy consumption. Landscape architects clearly have an important role to play in the research that the Green Energy Education Act promotes. So I urge the adoption of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments? Hearing none, the vote is on the bill. H.R. 1716 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. I recognize Mr. Hall to offer a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1716 as amended to the House with a recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that the staff be instructed to make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration. I yield back.
The question is on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move the members have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental minority or additional views on the measure. I move pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22 of the House of Representatives that the committee authorize the committee to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to adopt and pass H.R. 1716, the Green Energy Education Act of 2007, as amended. Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank the hardcore for staying here. We have one more to go. We're going to have votes about one. We're going to be right under the gun here. We will now consider H.R. 632, the H-Prize Act of 2007. I yield to the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Lipinski, 5 minutes to describe his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been here quite a while. I'll move quickly through this. This is a bill that's one more step in addressing global climate change and spurring national energy independence. It's a bill I've worked on closely with Mr. Inglis. Many people are familiar with this bill last year. Mr. Inglis and I, bill last year that he had introduced, we passed to the Science Committee, passed on the floor of the House by a vote of 416 to 6. Unfortunately, it stalled in the Senate last year. This year we have made some minor changes. Mr. Inglis is going to offer an amendment in a few minutes, and I think that these changes are going to help us to successfully get this bill through the Senate and signed by the President. And it's obvious now that with gasoline prices are so high, everyone's asking us, what are we going to do about this? It's not only the high cost of gasoline hitting us in the pocketbooks, but the cost of our addiction to oil also affect our environment and national security. We need to find a solution, and ARPA-E, I believe, is one big way towards a solution, but here's another way of looking at one particular possible solution in hydrogen. Hydrogen, when it's used as an energy source, produces no emissions besides water, and hydrogen-fueled cars already exist, but they are very expensive. We need to make some breakthroughs in order to be able to put a hydrogen car in every American's driveway. This legislation would establish prizes. Specifically, every 2 years, 4 $1 million prizes will be given for advances in production, storage, distribution, and utilization of hydrogen. One $4 million prize will be awarded for advances in prototype hydrogen vehicles. At the end of 10 years, a grand prize of $10 million will be given for transformational advance in hydrogen energy technology. The purpose of this is to go about it with the H-Prize is to really take advantage of America's greatest resource, our ingenuity and creativity. No one's being told exactly what to do. They're just being given a goal. They work on figuring out how to get there, just like the X-Prize did. We have some of the best and brightest minds in the U.S., as well as an economy that supports and encourages entrepreneurship. And the H-Prize will help focus this inventiveness to address the greatest challenge that our country faces today, is our addiction to oil and other fossil fuels. And we have to address global climate change, and energy independence is essential to our national security and also to reducing the prices that we face at the gas pump today. Investing in an alternative to fossil fuels such as hydrogen is a strong step in the right direction, holds tremendous potential, and I encourage all my colleagues to support the H-Prize Act. Yield back.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to Mr. English my time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The bill comes well recommended at a 416 to 6 vote last time through the House. So hopefully we can pass it through the House again and get it all the way to the Senate. The concept is patterned after the Ansari X Prize, which incentivized space flight, entrepreneurial space flight. So this H Prize is designed to do for hydrogen what the X Prize did for space flight, and that is to create an opportunity for entrepreneurs and inventors to come together and form teams that could help us break through to a hydrogen future. There are a number of technological challenges we face, and this is a non-bureaucratic, non-governmental way of breaking through some of those barriers. So I'm happy to be supporting it and urging its adoption here in the committee.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with amendments in order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is the gentleman from South Carolina's amendment offered in the nature of a substitute. I ask unanimous consent that the amendment in the nature of a substitute be treated as original text for purposes of amendment under the 5-minute rule. Without objection, so ordered. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 632 offered by Mr. Inglis of South
I ask
Carolina.
unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize Mr. English for 5 or less minutes to explain the substitute amendment.
Hopefully less, Mr. Chairman. This amendment incorporates several technical corrections as well as some suggestions from the Department of Energy General Counsel and from Mr. Lipinski's office. Essentially, the changes are these. It removes a provision that required all future hydrogen prizes to be modeled after the H Prize, clarifies the Secretary of Energy has the final say over prize criteria, federal funding, and judge selection, clarifies that the administering entity can sell naming rights to the prizes, changes the term intellectual property to trade secrets or confidential business information to protect the Department of Energy from claims about violating patents and trademarks, allows the Secretary of Energy to withhold such proprietary information from public disclosure. It also provides accountability by requiring an annual report to Congress identifying each award recipient and their developed technologies. So these are, I think that Mr. Lipinski may want to add to some description here.
Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Chairman?
Mr. Lipinski is recognized.
I fully support this amendment. It contains some improvements to the bill, especially importance are it helps to ensure accountability and promote commercialization of the prize, requires the Department of Energy to submit an annual report to Congress that identifies each award recipient and their technology, and also encourages commercialization by specifying the actions being taken by the recipients towards commercialization. So I fully support this amendment.
Are there other amendments to the amendment in nature of a substitute? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Is there any other amendment? Hearing none, the vote is on H.R. 632 as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. I recognize Mr. Hall to offer a motion.
Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 632 as amended to the House with a recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration. I yield back.
The question is on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move the members have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental views or minority, and I move pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22 of the Rules of the House of Representatives that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to adopt and pass H.R. 632, the H Prize Act of 2007 as amended. Without objection, so ordered. Many thanks to everyone, and I want to conclude this markup. Right on.
So,